So thank everybody who is here today. We have almost 100 people. I don't know how many folks were here for last week. There were probably several of you who were. There are probably some new folks. So what we're going to do is kind of go over some of the stuff that we went over last week. I'm going to give you just a brief rundown of what we do as CACE. And then I'm going to sort of spotlight some of the volunteers that we have on the Zoom chat today. And have them introduce themselves, and then we'll get started into the real meat of the program. We are, thank you for coming here today. We represent Californians Advancing Civic Education, which is a nonprofit organization that has been around for almost a decade, helping students like you participate in We the People and other civic education programs throughout the state. My name is Clint Woods. As you can see, I'm from CACE on my little Zoom name there. I'm the president of Californians Advancing Civic Education. I'm also an alumni of the program from back in 1995 at Amador Valley High School. We did pretty well. It was good. We liked it. And now, right now, I am a deputy attorney general for the state of California. One of many deputies attorney general, I'm not like the deputy attorney general, but I'm one of many. I'm really, really excited about how many people from throughout the state are participating in this program and the opportunity that this pandemic presents for us to reach out to schools that we don't ordinarily get a chance to reach. We've been running these summer sessions for over 6 years now, or for around 6 years now. And we have been broadcasting them the last couple of years, but now it's all, now that everything's online, we're really excited about the opportunity to just reach everybody equally. So what I'm going to do now is let the rest of the people who are here, who are volunteering, introduce themselves. And so maybe Supa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Suba. I'm also on CASE. I'm a VP, and I've been doing that since last year. But I've been volunteering with CASE since basically 2016. I'm an alum of the program, Foothill High School, class of 2011. I was Unit 5. Yeah, and I think we're really here for you all. We want your success is our success. So that's why we put on these summer sessions to best prepare you for a post-COVID world when it comes to We the People stuff.
Yeah. Great. Sean, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. My name is Sean Gentry. I am also an alum of the program, but from 2002, I went to Foothill that year. And I've been a volunteer with CASE for probably about a decade. I've been working with We the People since around 2017, when I started law school. And I've been a judge at the state competition and the regional and district competitions for about that long as well. So it's definitely a passion of mine. I love this stuff. I love this lecture in particular you'll see here today. Nowadays, I'm an attorney practicing law in San Francisco. I do employment law primarily, mostly litigation, but I also help small and mid-sized businesses with their employment issues. And I'm excited to be here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Jessica, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica. I'm an alum from 2016 San Luis Valley High School. We only had 2 years. I was the first one.
A good 2 years.
Yes, I was the good year, as Clint said. Anyways, but I just graduated from University of California, Santa Cruz with a double major in politics and sociology, and I'm now looking for work and doing all that. But this program really launched that for me, and it's amazing, and I'm so happy you all are here to do this, and the summer sessions are awesome. I'm so glad they were able to go online, and I'm really happy to be here.
Jessica, do you want to tell the kids about some of the work that you've done in college and volunteering and whatnot?
Yeah, sure. I've had 2 internships. I interned with Congressman Swalwell in the district office, and then I just got back from DC right before pandemic hit, interning with Senator Harris. So that was pretty amazing. And I'm looking forward. I did amazing coursework, did research with a professor, took a graduate class, and honestly, We the People really started all of that for me. So you guys are in a really good place. And yeah, look forward to working with you.
Great. And I think Daniel is here. Daniel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure, Clint. Hey, everybody. I'm Daniel, also We the People alum from 2014 from Amador Valley High School. Didn't win first place, unfortunately, but came close. What is it? So yeah, I've been working with CACE ever since I graduated, so 2015, so been quite a few years. And then I guess like throughout college, I did a lot of public policy research. I interned on Capitol Hill with the Congressional Research Service. So basically Congress's in-house consulting agency. Believe it or not, they actually do research. So yeah, but nowadays I'm a consultant working at Accenture, hacking websites. So very different.
Yeah. Thank you. Amy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Amy Kushner. I have been volunteering with CACE for about 4 years now. I'm the Vice President of Finance, and today I'm helping out doing the technical moderation of the Zoom for you all. I did not do We the People, but I did graduate from Amador way back in 1994. I have a background in finance and human resources and worked in tech, and I also did a lot of work in local politics. I ran a mayoral campaign in San Francisco in 2015, and currently I'm getting a master's in counseling and psychology.
Great. Thank you. So I think what we're going to do now or soon is I'm going to hand it over to Daniel to kind of talk about some features of scoring. All of the people that have just been introduced to you have judged at some level of the competition, be it district, regionals, state, or nationals. And many of the people, in fact, most of the people, if not all of the people who've just been introduced to you, will be your judges at some level as you go forward. And we obviously are very passionate about the program. It's a program that we care very much about, and it's a program that you all are going to get used to doing. Last week we went over what a hearing looks like, and what the structure of We the People is. If you weren't there for that, I highly recommend that you go back and watch that video when you get a chance. We posted it on our YouTube page. I don't exactly know what the YouTube link is, but you can get to it on our website, which is www.caciviceducation.org. There you can also find our Twitter, our Instagram, our Facebook, if you still use Facebook, and all of those things. So I highly recommend you go back and look at it. We had an alumni panel that did a fantastic job last week, kind of explaining how We the People works with an actual alumni testimony and Q&A. We're going to have something very similar today that's going to be a little bit more meat in terms of content, and we're really excited for you all to watch that. I know that a lot of folks, I just do want to mention that a lot of folks have been sending me emails about access to the CACE student Slack. I haven't gotten to them yet. I've gotten all your emails. Everybody who has sent an email, we will get you an invite probably this upcoming week, if not the next week, but certainly before our last summer session, which is on August 15th. If anybody hasn't sent an email and wants to send an email to be invited to the We the People Slack, the We the People student Slack, they can do so at my email address, which is clint@caciviceducation.org. We'll post that in the notes. Though I will want to note that if you are from Amador, Foothill, or Irvington, I already have your emails and you don't need to send me an email. So don't worry about that, okay? All right, so with that, Daniel, do you want to talk about scoring?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, are we going to screen share this or just go through it?
If you want to screen share, you should be able to.
Yeah, all right, let's do it. Give me a second. Dig it up. All right, let me know if this looks all right.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So hopefully everybody has access to this somehow. If you don't, please let us know. We can also post a link in the chat as well. But this is a score sheet. So when you're going into competition and judges are judging you, this is exactly what we see, and this is what we have to fill out as judges to score the competition, right? And before I go too much into it as well, right? So a lot of this is also sort of comparative, right? So a lot of the times it's like, okay, what does a 5 mean, or what does a 7 mean? Like a lot of the times we have to make kind of a judgment call in terms of like, okay, compared to different schools, what does that look like? So I don't want to like sort of go through this with the intention of like, oh, if you do this, you will get a 5, or you do this, you will get a 7. We can give you general guidelines, but to a degree, it's also comparative. But with that said, let's dive into it. So the first section that I really want to highlight is understanding, right? So understanding, it encompasses a lot, right? But most importantly, especially when a question brings up a topic, what we're looking for is, do you have kind of the foundations of understanding that issue? So let's say it's about presidential powers, right? Like, do you understand presidential powers in the context of like today, but also do you understand presidential powers in terms of like historical context, and sort of what are the things that kind of changed presidential powers throughout US history? So understanding, it's looking to more than just surface level sort of understanding. We're looking for breadth here and depth. So that's what we're looking for understanding. Constitutional application. I think that's pretty straightforward. So really what this is trying to highlight here is, are you able to go back to the source, right? Are you able to go back and apply constitutional concepts and citations into your testimony or your Q&A, right? So what this means is you can be using like obviously the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, or even the debates from the Constitutional Convention, right? Or arguably, you can also use Supreme Court cases, right? All of these are sort of direct sort of interpretations of the Constitution, and we're looking for citation for this. It definitely helps when you can cite, oh, from Article 1, Section 2, Clause whatever, right? Like that to us will be like, we'll be able to check this off in terms of, okay, you've applied sort of the constitutional application box here. So reasoning here, we're really looking for your logic, right? So a lot of these questions are opinion-based, and with opinion-based questions, a lot of the times what you're trying to look for is sort of, okay, you agree or disagree with something. Why did you agree or disagree with that, right? What is sort of that flow of logic there? So this is something where you definitely have to have a lot of discussion with your group mates about, right? So in terms of, okay, like, did we consider it from this angle, and then so if it's a I don't want to pick something too controversial, but like if it's a controversial topic, right, and you only cover one side of it, right, to us it seems like your reasoning may be a little weaker in this sense, because we don't see the full extent of how you arrived to only that position. So a lot of the times the stronger teams will have a higher reasoning score when they're able to explain the sort of perspectives of a controversial topic. So that's kind of what you're looking at for reasoning. And then for supporting evidence, really this is citation, right? Anybody can say they agree or disagree with something, but it's only it's only really substantial when you can have concrete evidence that you can point to. So this means citing research papers, citing court cases, citing speeches, whatever the case is, right? Like, so literally in your testimony or in your Q&A saying that according to a report in 2010 by so-and-so organization, like that will help your argument, but most importantly, it will help you sort of get the points that you need for this box here. And then the next section is responsiveness. So this is always a fun section. So a lot of the times, I think a lot of these topics become very, very passionate for a lot of people, right? And what happens is that students and even judges too will like get so into a topic, you kind of go completely off track of what the question was asking for. So really what we're looking for responsiveness is that, okay, you're not just making a good argument, are you responding to the question that's being asked, right? So it's always one of those moments where you gotta like kind of do a mental check of like, okay, like, are we on topic, right? So that's that section. And then finally, participation. So I think, especially as you go on, right, you'll notice in your unit, in your panel, that there's going to be certain people who are really great at public speaking, really good at thinking on their feet and able to answer at every single question, right? Or have a really good stage presence when they're presenting their testimony. But what we're looking for as judges is how much of most of the group was able to participate, right? So we're trying to look for roughly equal participation. So with certain judges, we kind of have a habit of sort of unofficially, right, on the score sheet, we'll put like each sort of person's name at the top of our kind of notes section, and we do tick marks of how many times somebody's talked, right? Not every judge does this, but like this is something that I do, and I know some of us do, because it helps us keep track of sort of how even it is between the whole group, and we're able to provide feedback and score this category properly. So yeah, so that's all the sections. Clint, do we want to go over the tiebreaker, or we're good here?
Sure. Before we go over the tiebreaker, I know that one of the questions that we get asked a lot is how to differentiate when you're writing a testimony or doing Q&A between understanding and reasoning, because it seems like there's a lot of overlap between those two. When you're a judge, Daniel, how do you differentiate between those two?
It's a really good question. So for me personally, right, when I'm looking for understanding, a lot of it to me is more about the context, right? It's like, do you understand the context of like what's happening with this particular topic that you're talking about, right? The historical context, the legal context, the civil rights aspect of it, right? Like, so do you understand all of these? Like kind of to me, that's more of the textbook sort of understanding, right? Do you understand the textbook definition of these things? And then for me, reasoning is sort of like, okay, now that you understand the basics, how can you formulate your argument based off of what you know, right? So reasoning to me is like the analytical aspect. Understanding is sort of like, okay, do you know A, B, and C, right? So hopefully that clarifies sort of the two sections there.
Yeah, the way I sort of look at it is, as maybe by way of an example, if a unit is there and they're saying that the president has relatively unchecked war powers, okay, that might be a good high score on understanding, because they understand that the limits on presidential war powers are not necessarily all that robust, or at least have developed to not necessarily be all that robust. But if they're saying that the president has unchecked war powers because Congress has not effectively moved to check the president, that might be a high reasoning score, because it demonstrates both understanding, but it also demonstrates reasoning, because you're making an argument. You're following a piece of understanding to its, you're demonstrating why something is that way, or why it maybe should be a different way. And that really is the kind of crux there. It's understanding is knowing the facts. Reasoning for me is making an argument and supporting the argument with those facts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was a really good example. Yeah.
Yeah. So Daniel, do you want to talk about what the judges do after they see a testimony and a Q&A with this score sheet?
Yeah. I mean, so during the Q&A, right, during the entire testimony, like we're taking a lot of notes, right? So right after sort of what we do it, and I think it varies from judge to judge too. For me, I personally kind of highlight sort of what I think checks off each of those boxes in my notes, and then I give like a tentative draft score of, okay, like I think so far this group I think is a 5 or a 6, and then like I work up or down from there. So, but then for me, a lot of it, it's like I also need feedback from other groups to see kind of how each sort of unit compares to each other. So that's my personal methodology. I don't know, Clint, if you wanted to share kind of how you'd go through it as well.
Yeah, I think what you said earlier about it being relative is absolutely true. I have definitely judged competitions where I've gone in and seen the first group and thought, man, these guys were dynamite. They were fantastic. I doubt I'm going to see another group all day that's as good as the group that I just saw. And then I go and I see 3 more groups that work better. So if I had given them that first group all 10s, which I don't give very many 10s for the record, but if I had given them all 10s, then I wouldn't have anywhere to go with those next 3 groups. So I usually hold off. I definitely, and the judges generally, the way it's going to work is when you're presenting a panel, there are going to be generally 3 judges on a judging panel who are going to be scoring you. Sometimes there's 2, but usually there's 3. And after they're done judging you, and I've judged with pretty much everybody here at some point or another, we go back in the hallway, and it'll be a virtual hallway, where we discuss and we say, hey, I really liked their constitutional application. I thought that the evidence that they used was fantastic. I thought that maybe their reasoning and their responsiveness maybe could have used some work. And then we can talk about, did you think that panel A was better than panel B? Maybe not. I thought panel B was better. And then at the end of the day, then I kind of go in and fill in those scores. I think you should all know that the judges do not always agree on who is the best or what the scores are. Generally, I've never judged a panel where I've been like, I've judged 10 teams and I thought team A was the best and team X was the worst, and then somebody else said, no, team X is the best and team A was the worst. I've never had a panel like that, but I've definitely had panels where maybe my 1, 2, 3 are in a different order than the judges next to me. And that's fine. That happens all the time. Usually judges tend to agree, but it's a subjective score, so you're going to get disagreement.
Yeah. So I think what this kind of goes to show is that like practice makes like a lot better, right? I don't want to say perfect, but in the sense of like just being able to get a lot of feedback from a lot of different people, from a lot of different judges will help. Because I think some students may criticize, oh, this isn't a hard like score like math or something like that. And it really isn't, right? So what you have to do is you have to go through your testimony and your Q&A with a lot of different people, with a lot of different opinions so that you're ready for anything that comes at you. So yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to briefly explain the tiebreaker?
Yeah, sure. So tiebreaker, it's kind of a bonus score, not bonus score, but like sort of what happens is that like in case of like 2 schools are like have the exact same score, then what we do is that like we go back to the tiebreaker to see, okay, like which one has the overall higher tiebreaker, right? So then like it's like if they have 2 score, then it's like out of 100. So then like if I thought, okay, like both of these technically got the same score, but if I had to like say one unit was better than the other unit, I would say this school was slightly better by like 2 tiebreaker points, right? So it's kind of like if absolutely necessary, and we don't use it too often, but it's there in case if we need it.
Yeah, competitions have been decided on tiebreakers before. The year following me, I know in 1996, the gold medal was decided on a tiebreaker. So it's rare, it's super rare because, at the end of the math works out, each judge has a total of 60 points. So it's a total of 180 points per unit. And usually there's a couple of rounds. So at the end of the day, you're looking at a score of like 1,800, 1,900 points. So it's rare that you end up with the exact same score, but it happens. It happens from time to time. Yeah. And
I think that one example is so famous that it sort of proves the importance of the tiebreaker.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, so later today, Jessica is going to go into a lot more depth on evidence and give you some types of evidence to use. But right now we are going to get into what is in many ways like the crux of the program. One thing that We the People really does, I think excellently, is describe how the sort of philosophical conversations that the founders were having at the time of the founding are very, very similar, if not identical, to the conversations that we're having today. And so in order for you to understand those conversations fully, you have to get a background on the philosophy itself. So Sean is going to start us off and talk about classical Republican philosophy.
Do you want to run the slideshow for this? I think that would be helpful.
I think Amy can.
Great. Okay, so today we're going to talk about what are the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system. And so this is commonly considered sort of the Unit 1 topic. You see that's right at the top. But we're covering two specific parts of it today, which is natural rights philosophy and classical republicanism. And the reason we're covering those topics in summer session is they're universal to all 6 units of the We the People program. And so it's important that not just your Unit 1 students understand these issues, but that all units understand these issues, because they will come into play frequently when we're talking about the presidency, when we're talking about the importance of checks and balances, when we're talking about case law, the Supreme Court, when we're talking about modern aspects of our government and the public good being perpetuated by our government in the 21st century. All of these topics are going to be important. So Unit 1 does cover a wide range of things. It covers things like the British foundation of our government. It includes colonial charters, state constitutions, and it covers things like Judeo-Christian tradition, which largely influenced many of our founders. And it also will explain how the history leading up to our founding played a huge role in the founders' decisions for our forms of government, including feudalism, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment era, and all these things that influenced them. And these individuals who wrote our system of government were very well read. And we know this because they wrote to each other all the time. And they had great libraries that are still in existence today. For example, Thomas Jefferson's library became sort of the foundation for the Library of Congress in Washington, what is and now in Washington, D.C. And so Jefferson and John Adams in particular were very prolific in reading all of these scholarly books and writing to each other. Abigail Adams and John Adams wrote to each other all the time as well. Abigail Adams herself was very well read. And all these individuals were telling us what was influencing them in founding the government. And so when it comes to classical republicanism, why don't we go to the next slide? We compare that with natural rights philosophy. They're sometimes considered a little bit opposed to each other, as in, doing something for the common good is sometimes considered to be opposed to doing things within your self-interest or for natural rights. But they're not as opposed as you might think. Both philosophies are focused on furthering society, furthering the goods of the community, not just the individual. So when we say natural rights, we don't necessarily just mean doing things in your own self-interest or doing things the way we sort of modernly think of individual rights or free speech or whatever it might be. What we really mean is fundamental rights and how those affect the contracts that we form with our system of government so that it provides for us and we don't have to provide for it. And so on the flip side, classical republicanism is really to do with how we can support our society and our friends, our colleagues, and our government. Both for security of our state, but also in furthering the interests and hopefully the happiness of its citizens. And so we'll touch on both those things. Natural rights philosophy will come a little bit later in the late morning or early afternoon, but we're going to forge ahead with the classical republicanism and the philosophies behind that. Sometimes classical republicanism is referred to as civic humanism, which in some ways is a little more descriptive of what we're talking about here. And it's based on antiquity. Actually, why don't we go to the next slide before we keep moving on? And so, both classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy talk a lot about what is human nature. Is it in our nature to be virtuous? Is it in our nature to support our community and have a high morality? And on the flip side, with you'll hear with natural rights philosophy, we talk a lot about the state of nature, what it means to form a contract with your governing body, and both philosophies will touch on good and bad governments. So I'll touch on the classical republicanism. You'll hear about bad forms of tyranny a little bit later with natural rights. And, all of these philosophers were really focused on what is the purpose of government, what is the purpose of the politics, and not just, looking at history for its own sake, but wondering why certain things worked, why certain things didn't work, and what would be best for our form of government in, the late 1700s. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so again, we're still comparing here a little bit. And on the classical Republican side, there are some real main ideas here. So when we're talking about the polis, what that means is the state or the government, our system of ruling our nation or our group of individuals. And then the politeia refers to sort of how that form of the state is structured. So the constitution, and I'm using that word really loosely, or the organization or arrangement of the state by the people and for the people, or by its leaders for the people. And so those two concepts come into play really early in Western history, starting with Greek and Roman republics and city-states. And they were very much focused on this idea of civic virtue. And so if I was able to ask you all to chime in here, I'd say, what does civic virtue mean? Civic virtue means public good. It means doing things for the benefit of the public and not necessarily just following your own self-interest, even if it's enlightened self-interest. And the people who were expected to engage in civic virtue were the citizens. And citizens or citizenship essentially means public life. So citizenship is not just a right that people have or something that gives you value in society. It also meant that you were prepared to go out in the public and do things in your public life for the benefit of the community, and not necessarily just for your own self-interest. Now, in antiquity, not everyone was citizens, just like, in our founding era, not everyone was considered a citizen. They had slavery the way that our founding era had slavery. It was a somewhat different form of slavery, but, obviously insidious nonetheless. Those people didn't have the same rights that the citizens had. Obviously, throughout our history, Western culture, citizenship has been held by select groups of people, typically white landholding men. And so that means that a lot of people were in many ways disenfranchised and not part of this system that we're just about to talk about with education and creating a public life for the citizens. And so I mentioned that because I want everyone to remember that there were problems here still. We hadn't yet gotten to a point where we had universal suffrage or equality. Maybe we're still not there yet. But, our founding era framers put us on the track that has gotten us where we've gotten today. It's also worth mentioning that these communities in antiquity were relatively homogeneous, meaning they were formed of like-minded people of similar demographic backgrounds living in small communities. And so, unlike some of the very diverse cultures that we have here in the United States, modernly, at the founding era, it was much more similar to these Greek and Roman city-states that had either homogeneous communities or mostly homogeneous communities. And the founders felt that that was important because it meant that these people were all similarly aligned and pulling together in ways that should hopefully promote the common good, stability of society, order and protection for its individuals, and justice, is order. And so there was certainly a hierarchy too, even back then, meaning there were certainly rulers, maybe a king sometimes, an aristocracy, and everyone else essentially, or sometimes maybe the rich and the poor. Natural rights philosophy, which we'll touch on more later, you can see in the right-hand column here, had some similar ideas regarding a civil person, but it really flows out of this idea of fundamental rights and individual sovereignty in ways that are somewhat at odds with what we're going to talk about for the rest of this presentation. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Right, so eventually we get to this point where our founders are forming a republic. We have a republican form of government, elected officials acting on our behalf to further the interests of society and our government. And we got there through these philosophers. You see a couple listed here. And really, when we say classical republicanism, that's not what the Greeks called their system of government. This is what the Renaissance era and our founding fathers referred to when they looked back at and tried to revive or understand what was happening in antiquity. And the question you should ask, or that we ask, is why is this the form of government that our founders chose? And part of the answer to that is it's what they knew. It came out of the English common law system. England is essentially a republic at this time in our history. It is a monarchy, but there's some mixed government going on. And many of the colonial charters and the colonial forms of government were various forms of republic, starting with the House of Burgesses in Virginia in the early 1600s, the Jamestown colony. They formed republics, and they were elected individuals acting on behalf of the people, often single legislative bodies rather than sort of this larger form of government that we understand the United States to have today. But flowing out of the Renaissance, people like Machiavelli looked at these philosophers, looked at these forms of government, and created this understanding of what a modern republic should look like if these were the best forms of government. And people like John Adams looked back at the Roman Republic, James Madison, and they said that form of government lasted 500 years before it became an empire, and looks very stable to us. It seemed to further the interests of the people better than any other form of government we can identify. That's what we want. And so that's, we ended up with the system of government. And so Plato, the first name you see on this list, talked about the importance of the enlightened leaders. And so when we're talking about a republic, he uses the phrase res publica, which means the public thing, the things of the people. And he wrote something called the Republic, right? And so he was very focused on this. And the Republic is based on civic virtue. And Plato's concepts are essentially that in order to have a just set of rulers, they need to be either philosophers themselves, or they need to have the nature of philosophers, the nature of people like Socrates, so that they are not grinding us all under their boot with their power. They're actually engaged in virtuous activity to further the interests of society and not just accumulate power for themselves. So that's sort of Plato's concept of what a republic should be, right? And so civic virtue means public good, as I mentioned before, and it's really based on this idea of morality and education, these two things, and those things go hand in hand. When I say morality, I don't necessarily mean religious morality, although many of our founders were very religious and it influenced their philosophies very much. What I really mean is doing things that are for the common good, doing things that are beneficial to society. And how did we become moral people? It's through education. And so the founders and the Greeks and the Romans valued education very highly, as does our modern society. And the goal of education is to instill virtue in the citizens in preparation for their role in public life. That's the purpose of the education. So it's not necessarily to teach history or science or whatever, but when we talk about classical Republican education, it's to make sure these individuals are prepared to lead the state and to have a good public life engaged in civic virtue. Commonly what's lost here in this discussion is also the value of the military, protecting the state. That's part of the common good, often talked about, in these scholarly articles. We don't always touch on it modernly, but stability of the community was very strong. Common and strong defense was very important in furthering the common good. Okay. So next comes Aristotle, right? And Aristotle looks at what's going on in Rome and or in Italy, or what we call Italy now, and Greece, and he focuses on good and bad forms of government. And so when he looked at the sort of types of government, there were really there's three forms. There's rule of the one, rule of the few, and rule of the many. And so rule of the one should be somewhat obvious. We call that a monarchy or an empire, where there's one powerful leader ruling our society. He called the good version of this a monarchy and the bad version of this a tyranny, based on, a tyrant. Of course, our English words are a little different than whatever his Greek words were, but that's the gist. The rule of the few is, the good version is the aristocracy, the rich elite ruling us, hopefully nobly. The bad version is an oligarchy. And on the many, the good version he called the polity, and the bad version is democracy, right? So democracy, that's a little bit of a surprise. Why are we calling that the bad version? And the reason is what Aristotle was really looking at, good or bad, is the government established and functioning for the good of society as a whole, or are they focused on their self-interest? And if they're focused on their self-interest, that's the bad form. And so when we say democracy here, what Aristotle really means is mob rule, or, you know, a large group of people banding together in their own self-interest, probably to oppress the rich and reallocate wealth amongst the lower classes of society. And so that was the bad form of democracy. But there is a good form of democracy, which he called polity, and that's essentially collective organization of lots of individuals, typically the poor individuals of society, not the aristocracy, for the goal of furthering the society around them. So that was, you know, that's something that he was focused on, that our founders were focused on. And not seen here is another Greek philosopher named Polybius. And Polybius looked at all these concepts and said, well, the best form is some sort of a mixed form of these three functions, right? So a mixed government or a mixed polity, where we combine all three, has the most stability because all the different segments of society have a stake in the game, they have an interest, and they have a goal of working together, hopefully, to further society. And so what does that look like? Maybe we can see some examples. And so that kind of sounds like the executive branch, the one, the legislative branch in the Senate as the few, maybe the aristocracy, especially at the time of our founding, where it was a very elite institution, and the many being the House of Representatives. And we saw this, you know, as influencing the founders. It also sort of maybe coincidentally is how the British government was set up at the time. We had the, you know, King George, the monarchy. You also had the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And so all of that sort of formed and affected how the founders created their state governments, and then how they created the national federal government when we got to the Constitution era. So that's Polybius. And Polybius also talked about our leaders needing a deep desire for noble acts in furtherance of the state, both the political arms, the military arms, and the moral institutions providing our state education. These concepts greatly influenced Montesquieu, who you'll undoubtedly learn about if you're in Unit 1, but Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of the Laws in about 1748, and that in turn influenced our founders even more, who read both the modern scholars like Montesquieu and also the things coming out of antiquity like Polybius and Aristotle. Aristotle also went on to say there are three functions of government, and so those functions of government are to make the law, to enforce the law, and interpret the law. Also sounds kind of similar to our branches of government. So who's making the law? The Congress, is the legislature. Who's enforcing the law? Our executive branch, or the president. And who is interpreting law? We have a judicial system. And the English had a judicial system based on common law as well that existed at that time. Now, then you look at the Roman era. So now we're moving past the Greeks, and you've got this guy Cicero. And Cicero was very focused on what is the ideal state. And Cicero had sort of the benefit of living at the time, or benefit or detraction of living at the time when the Roman Republic became an empire. Julius Caesar was assassinated, and he saw the transition. He fought against the transition in the era following that assassination. And so he looked at this and he thought republics are stable, and that's what we want in a government. We want stability. We want to see what he called enlightened absolutism, which is essentially benevolent despotism. But he wanted to see that people leading our government were engaged in civic good, civic virtue, and that they weren't just trying to accumulate power. And that greatly, you know, Cicero in particular greatly influenced John Adams, who wrote the Massachusetts state constitution and was a large influence over the writing of our federal constitution, along with other people, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, etc. Thomas Aquinas is mentioned here also because he is somewhat attributed to the revival of this classical Republican idea within the Catholic Church. And essentially he looked at Aristotle and what he saw as classical republicanism, and he defined it in ways that were accessible to our modern or pre-modern founders and scholars. And he talked about the cardinal virtues, and it's very important to act virtuously in leading society. Cardinal virtues to him included prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude, to be differentiated a bit with religious virtues such as faith, hope, and charity, although ideally in his mind, and maybe in the mind of many of the founders, they overlapped. You'd have both civic virtue and religious virtue. So that was something that was important to the founders. And he talked about these ideas as coming out of natural law, as certain principles promoting good, evil should be avoided, and these ideas of virtue flow out of our society in that way. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll move through the rest of the slides pretty quick. This was sort of the most important one here. So humans are social animals, right? And so when we say they're part of the polis or polis animals, they like to band together. Humans don't like isolation, they like to work together. And so they have unique talents and capacities, but when combining them together, it can create stronger communities. All of us working together can hopefully make this society happy and virtuous, look out for the common interests, look out for the common good, the strength and stability of our society, and a strong common defense. A lot of these philosophers also looked at human nature as being one of excellence, and it's important for our leaders to have strong reasoning and to speak well. Cicero was considered sort of a great orator, and they found that to be very valuable. On the other hand, demagogues or tyrants were to be avoided in our form of government. And so the founders were strongly trying to avoid a system of government that led to tyranny. They looked at people like Cincinnatus in the Roman Republic, who was granted absolute power, granted tyrannical leadership twice, actually, and both times sort of did what he needed to do and handed it back to the Senate or the Republic. And that's what they wanted from people like George Washington and our leaders. Hasn't always worked out that way, but it, again, stresses the importance of morality and education, discipline, and public spiritedness. Next slide, please. All right, so then we talk about what is the purpose of politics, and the founders again were really focused on this idea of civic virtue, and looking a little ahead in history at something called utilitarianism under Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, this idea of creating a society that will further the good and the happiness of the most people possible in the affected society, even if that sometimes goes against the individual freedoms or individual will of certain people. And so the goal of politics and our government, hopefully, is to create the most good for the most people in our society. And we get there both through this civic virtue, but also enlightened self-interest. The founders were realists, and they understood, especially after the Articles of Confederation, that they couldn't just hope that our leaders would act charitably and hope for the best. It was, in fact, important to create checks and balances, to create elections, to do things that made sure they had some interest, self-interest, in furthering our society, essentially creating goodwill for the people to get reelected, things of that nature. And similarly, in the electorate, hopefully, enlightened self-interest would lead to electing representatives who would further the good interests of society and not the self-interest or the bad interests of the society through some kind of tyranny majority. The hope was they'd create streets and roads and not oppress people, essentially. And of course, we have the importance of maintaining strong defenses. The Army, was founded, the Department of Defense, the Army and the Navy were founded around this time. It's right there in Article 1 of the Constitution, as powers given to Congress for spending powers. The president was the commander-in-chief, et cetera, et cetera. So they were not forgetting to promote strong defense of this nation. Next slide, please. We talked earlier about small homogeneous communities, and in the founding era, that was still the case. We had largely agrarian communities in most states. All states were slaveholding states at this time, or leading up to this time, and relied in different ways on slaves and indentured servants. And so the leadership, though, was essentially white landholding men. Some states didn't require property for the purposes of voting. But in general, the communities of citizens of the states were white men. And they, therefore, were relatively homogenous, both in their demographics, but also in their upbringing, their beliefs, their education. Certainly the ones who were leading us were relatively homogenous. A lot of them were scholars, a lot of them were merchants, things of that nature, or plantation owners. And the goal here was for these small communities to have wise and deliberative rule, to have strong education, to prepare citizenships for rule, and hopefully to churn out civically virtuous citizens. Of course, it never always works out that way, but that was ultimately the goal of these communities and the different systems of government they set up. And of course, strong defenses, Next slide, please. Right, so when we talk about democracy, and when I mentioned mob rule earlier, the thing that our founders wanted to avoid was uncontrolled passion. And that essentially means everyone following their passions, going out to satisfy their own interests. In Virginia, we saw that the legislature was essentially taken over by the farmers, taken over by the poor. Our leaders, our framers, were the aristocracy. They didn't like that. They didn't want to see that sort of behavior and that sort of mob rule that replaced the aristocracy from the leadership power. And so they hoped to avoid that, but they also wanted to make sure that the aristocracy, the executive, had good civic virtue, good personal virtue, and they were not just self-interested rulers. So there's a lot of focus on the economy in this sense. Aristotle too was very focused on the economy. And in both instances, both with Aristotle and our framers, they felt that the best people to rule us were sort of what I'll call the middle class, but the people of moderate means, the people who weren't so wealthy that all they cared about was holding on to their wealth, or the people who were oppressed and poor, and what they really wanted was to get out of their condition, to make more wealth, and to become better, wealthier, protected members of society. It was the people in the middle who were not controlled by passion as much, because they were relatively satisfied in their lives. They weren't so focused on making money or keeping money, and they were able to spend their time on education, reading, understanding the law, writing, and becoming good civic participants. Next slide, please. And so we see the early state governments, right? And so that leads, the successes and failures of those under different forms of republicanism led to our US government in the 1787, 1789. And in the founders' experiences with those governments, both good and bad, helped them understand the importance of uniformity. And uniformity also can mean religious, racial, and ethnic, but I think also means uniformity of ideas. And then they were also focused on rigorous citizenship requirements. Greece was as well, Rome was as well. Residency was considered very important because people should have an interest in the benefit and the good of the land, the area that they were residing in. If people were really transient, they wouldn't have as much enlightened interest in keeping that place virtuous and good for them and their friends. And so, property was also important. For better or worse, mostly worse, gender and race were for hundreds of years in our society determinative of who had citizenship. And the founders kept that form and furthered that form of government until amendments to the Constitution allowed for greater suffrage and greater enfranchisement. But certainly they were influenced by that with homogenous communities in Greece and Rome. And these communities were also relatively small population-wise. Move on to the next slide. So we can see a lot of these principles embodied in our founding documents. And let's just go straight to the next slide. So founding documents mean things like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence, but there are other things too. So, right, we've got Massachusetts Constitution. You can see a quote here about the happiness of the people, good order, etc. I'm being corrected that suffrage means getting the right to vote. Oh, I guess just clarification. Thank you, Jessica. And you see this other quote from Pennsylvania and its state constitution. Again, you can see these concepts. I'm not going to read this quote. You can read it for yourself. But you can see these concepts are being embodied already in our state constitutions by people like John Adams, by people like Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, in ways that allowed classical republicanism to flourish and then, approximately 10, 15 years later, influence our final form of government. Next slide, please. So we mentioned the Declaration of Independence, the early Constitution, and the US Constitution. We can just move right past this slide. And so in those documents, we see some specific examples of classical republicanism, just like later you'll see some specific examples of natural rights philosophy. Here they are, the preamble to the Constitution. Very influential set of words that have gone on to influence many other forms of government, including the name of this program, We the People. It's a government formed by us, for us, to further our interests. And so they were looking at our government as something that was here to protect the people of the United States, to further our interests and not the other way around, not like the monarchy in England, as the founders saw it, where the government existed, or the people existed to further the interests of the government sometimes. The government is our servant in that sense. The Senate, the House of Representatives, the Senate in particular represents, I think, this idea of republicanism very clearly, where it's sort of a tiered system of state legislatures then passing on representation to the Senate. It's a very classical republicanism concept. Eligibility requirements, plenary legislative powers left to the states, and so we have this system of federalism, essentially allowing people to self-govern. And that was important to the founders too. In fact, very important. In many ways, certain founders were worried that the central government would trample on the state governments in ways that they didn't like. And they wanted small homogeneous communities to largely govern themselves. And so we still have this system today where you'll have a local municipality, you'll have a state government, and then the federal government. There's sort of 3 tiers of federalism that all play a role in our active daily lives. And the founders felt the closer the representatives were to the people, both in demographics, but also direct location, the more likely they were to govern civically virtuous and protect our interests. Next slide, please. I think we're almost done. And we are done. So with that, you see what classical republicanism was, how it affected our founders, and why it is so important to the system of government we have here today. And as we go through this program, we'll talk about lots of examples in all 6 units about different parts of our Constitution that are flowing directly out of classical republicanism, John Adams, and Aristotle.
Great. Thank you, Sean. We are going to take a quick break for about 5 minutes. And then at about 11:08, we're going to have a group of alumni come back and do more presenting about where you find some of these classical Republican concepts in our founding documents, okay? What I'd like to have some of the judges do is introduce yourselves, then ask the panel to introduce themselves, then read the question and let them get going. We can do 8 minutes of Q&A, but if the panel can time, the judging panel can time, that would be great. Okay? Sound good?
Megan, you got a timer? All right, cool. Hi guys, my name is Vaishya Koda. I was in Unit 4 last year at Foothill High School.
Hi, I'm Emma Reddy, and I was also in Unit 4, but at Amador High School, Amador Valley.
Hello, my name is Ning Wang. I was in Unit 3 and 6 from Amador Valley.
My name is Megan Chung. I was in Unit 5 at Foothill. Your question today is, how do America's... Introduce yourselves.
Hi, my name is Arushi Avachat. I was in Unit 5 at Foothill High School.
Hi, my name is Rashab Raj, and I was at Unit 4 at Amador Valley High School last year.
Hi, my name is Caroline Gang. I was a member of Unit 2 at Amador Valley High School last year.
Hi, my name is Audrey Im, and I was a member of Unit 4 at Foothill High School last year.
Okay, your question today is, how do America's founding documents reflect a classical Republican commitment to civic duties? In what ways do they fail to do so? You may begin when you're ready.
Classical republicanism, which we define as a commitment to the common good via civic participation, was a guiding force for the leaders of the American Revolution and the framers at the Federal Convention. However, in many ways, early American leaders failed to fully implement this philosophy. Our founding documents highlight both founders' successes and many failures in their classical Republican commitment to civic duties.
Our founding documents attempted to emphasize civic duties through classical republicanism in several ways. The framers' vision for the presidency took inspiration from George Washington and the ancient Roman figure Cincinnatus, both of whom exemplified the classical Republican ideal of putting the common good ahead of individual desire. Thus, according to Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist 68, it was in the best interest of the country to elect the president through the Electoral College. or a small number of persons who would possess the information and discernment to ensure that both the president and the election process would be virtuous.
The founding documents also intended to properly represent the country's population. Article 5 of the Articles of Confederation mandated annually appointed delegates to the Confederation Congress, restricted by term limits, state population, and state recall. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution allocates seats of the House of Representatives to each state by population, determined by a census conducted every 10 years. Thus, as long as the people exercise their civic duty to vote, their will would be represented in the national legislature, at least in theory.
The founding documents also emphasized and protected one major classical Republican civic duty, jury duty. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson accused King George III for depriving the colonists in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury of one's peers. Thus, the Bill of Rights, specifically the Sixth Amendment, granted all citizens the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury in all criminal cases, permanently enshrining this classical Republican civic duty in our Constitution.
Unfortunately, our founding documents failed to uphold classical Republican ideals in crucial ways. Although the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, documents such as the Constitution tacitly endorsed chattel slavery through the 3/5 Clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause. Despite appeals from colonial women such as Abigail Adams to remember the ladies, no founding document mentioned women. Thus, despite the existence of the House of Representatives as a form of representing popular will, large segments of the population were and still are excluded.
Additionally, none of the founding documents reflect any commitment to an incredibly important civic duty, education. Aristotle drew the connection between education and civic commitment in Book 3 of Politics, noting that liberty and equality will be best attained when all persons alike share in the government to the utmost. With our framers seeking to maintain the status quo against the masses, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights never once mentioned the word education as a right or ideal to attain, leaving states to set their own standards.
Similarly, many founding documents heavily restricted another classical Republican civic duty, voting. Early state constitutions, such as South Carolina's Constitution of 1776, only allowed white men with 100 acres of tax land the right to vote, meaning the vast majority of South Carolina's population was disenfranchised. Most of the original 13 states also had similar qualifications for voters, showing a widespread failure to protect this fundamental part of classical republicanism.
Ultimately, the founders only shallowly incorporated classical Republican values into their documents because of the contradiction between the small, homogeneous communities of classical republicanism and the vast and diverse population of America. As America has evolved, these failures have intensified, and the battle to uphold those civic duties for all individuals across the nation continues. Thank you.
Time.
Okay.
So you mentioned jury duty as a right. So how has the right to trial by jury evolved throughout U.S. society, and how has it changed over time?
I believe that since the founding era and the writing of these founding documents, we've been in an evolution to ensure that these civic duties are applied equally. Cases such as Batson v. Kentucky 1988 and Flowers v. Mississippi 2018 worked to ensure that trial by jury was an equal process and attempted to eliminate racial bias in this institution in order to ensure that classical republicanism, which is the desire to represent the common good, was truly applicable to all of the public.
We've also seen, Okay, we've also seen attempts to incorporate the Sixth Amendment or the amendment that allows for the right to trial by jury in criminal cases to the states. For example, in Duncan v. Louisiana in 1968, the right to trial by jury was incorporated into all the states or applied to all of the states, even in petty cases or cases where people were sentenced to 6 months or less. So even with a short sentence, we can see the importance of a jury.
I guess I'll go next. So in testimony towards the end, you mentioned the right to vote still being somewhat of an issue and in regards to classical republicanism, Republican values. So what groups do you think should still be enfranchised today? Or need to be enfranchised?
I think one group that has seen their voting rights heavily restricted and should have their right to vote be more accessible are formerly incarcerated persons. In 2016, the people of Florida passed Amendment 4, which granted all formerly incarcerated persons the right to vote. However, the Republican Florida legislature responded with Senate Bill 7066, which required all such persons to have paid all fines before regaining the right to vote. And after a series of court cases, this Senate bill still stands. And unfortunately, because of this bill, and because most formerly incarcerated persons are overwhelmingly of low income, they're unable to pay these fines and still do not have their voting rights. And while Florida is only one of a few states to have such laws in place, I believe removing such laws entirely is absolutely necessary.
Similar to Florida's, other states have passed incredibly restrictive voter ID laws. For example, Texas voter ID law accepts 7 accepted IDs except for student ID, and then a 2014 Government Accountability Office study found that voter turnout was reduced by 2 to 3%, meaning thousands of votes lost simply because of the incredibly strict standard of voter ID.
Additionally, in recent years, we've seen a rise in voter suppression throughout the United States. Shelby County v. Holder 2013 almost entirely dismantled the Voting Rights Act, which required a pre-clearance requirement for localities that had a history of racial voter suppression. And we've seen a rise in this in recent years. And as a result, I believe we need to pass the 2020 Voting Rights Act in order to secure voting rights for all Americans.
You mentioned in your testimony that there were large segments of the population that aren't, included in the House of Representatives, that aren't necessarily represented. So, in your opinion, how would you reform the House in order to, ensure that those large groups are included?
Well, I think one step into reforming the House of Representatives is to include a number of representatives for territories. Currently, there are no representatives in the House for territories such as Puerto Rico. And because of this, this also not only affects how they're represented in Congress, but how they're represented in the Electoral College, because the Electoral College is the number of people in, or is the number of electors is the same as the number of people in Congress. So I think by giving representatives to territories, we can not only give them representation in Congress, but also in the election process.
I think another reform that we should make to the House of Representatives would be to increase the size of the House. NYU law professor Christopher M. Straw, in his 2015 Law Review article, mentions that the average size of congressional districts in the House of Representatives is roughly 1 representative for every 750,000 constituents. This is obviously too large of a ratio for any representative to fully represent their district. And as a result, in order to secure re-election, many representatives have turned to moneyed interests in order to gain funds for their campaign. And thus they represent the interests of these lobbying groups and special interests rather than the people. But by increasing the size of the House, representatives would be more reliant on the people for re-election rather than on money, and thus they would more properly represent the will of the people.
And in reforming the House, we should also look to various political philosophies. One such philosopher is Hannah Arendt and her 4 theories of representation, including symbolic representation, where representatives are focused on to more accurately revolve their constituents' opinions. So not only while we reform the House, we should look into how representatives are representing their constituents today.
So you say that the founders created the Electoral College for the common good, yet many people are experiencing voter apathy today because they believe that their vote does not matter. So do you think that the Electoral College still stands as a virtuous part of our country today?
I do not believe that the Electoral College still stands as a virtuous part of our country, even though that's what the framers intended when creating the Electoral College. However, I don't believe the framers anticipated that California would have a population of 40 million people and Wyoming would have a population of 500,000. So I think we created an amendment process for this particular reason. And I agree with representatives such as Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are in favor of abolishing the Electoral College.
I agree with Arushi, and according to an article by the Washington Post in 2016, A vote in Wyoming counts 3.6 times more than a vote in California because of the distribution of electors between the states. So just like Arushi said, our founders, of course, didn't intend for this vast difference in our population. However, with the changes that we've seen today, we need to implement a new way to properly represent our population.
Okay.
So you guys also say that education is tantamount for people to exercise their civic duty, but that's nowhere in the founding documents. So do you think that there should be an amendment that specifically states the right to education for all?
I think that specifically stating an amendment at this point in our current history is going to be just an empty statement. And I don't know specifically what amendment could do, but I think that we can look to Congress in passing legislation that would help to further make education more accessible to our communities. For example, with the Higher Education Act and with presidential candidates trying to advocate for a cancellation of student debt in higher education, I think we can see the importance of Congress not in passing an amendment, but passing just laws.
The time was up. Good job.
Thank you.
Feedback?
Yeah, are we giving feedback?
Yeah, give feedback.
Okay, great. Okay, I can start. That was really good, you guys, for a little testimony that you guys wrote up. I thought the testimony is really well thought out. I thought you could have inputted like your guys' personal opinions more, or maybe like disagreed on something. However, I think ultimately like you guys really walked us through and I was able to understand everything. So a couple things. Rashab, I think your answers were a little bit long, but they were definitely well thought out, and you had, like, all of you guys had a lot of good evidence. I especially liked, Audrey, your answer about the territories and that them having more representation. As for the right to vote issue that Baishek asked, I think that Carolyn and Arushi, your guys' answers were like not as responsive, because the question was like, oh, who should be enfranchised? And you kind of went to talking about like Shelby County and like, oh, there are many voting rights issues. And it's like, yeah, we know that. And my last thing is, I don't know if you guys saw, but Megan put up like a 1-minute sign. And then I thought you guys should have just like jumped in on the electoral college question again. But instead, like we went to a new question, and then you guys didn't like, there wasn't like ample time to answer the question. So that was like a little bit of an awkward ending, but overall it was really good. And yeah, you guys were really thorough. Good job.
Yeah, Emma pretty much covered everything, but it was a great testimony. I agree with everything that she said. I don't really have anything to add over what she mentioned, but keep in mind it has been almost 4 months since we looked at We the People, so this is amazing for that level.
I think that you guys did a really good job. Your testimony was really good signposted, so I could tell exactly when you guys were talking about like the good parts of it and when the founding documents like failed to reflect it. And so that was really clear. I also really like the way that you guys built off of each other. For example, in that last question, or in the electoral college question, Arushi was talking about Wyoming and California, and then Audrey came in with like specific statistics for each of those, and I thought that was like really good. And you guys did that for all the other questions as well. And then I echo all of the like things to work on that Emma said.
Yeah, I don't have much to add besides what's already been said. But one thing you might look at is with jury duty, it's not just the 6th Amendment. There's also the 7th Amendment for in civil cases and other stuff. And you could also look at how the Electoral College was rather one-sided, and that's pretty much all the feedback I have. And I guess some of the times we were speaking over each other, but I guess that was more to the video delay, not other issues.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, guys.
I thought it was fantastic. Just so everybody understands what happened. 2 weeks ago, you all were given this assignment, and then you drafted a testimony that is just for the people who are listening to this or who are participating in this summer session. I just think that's really impressive. That kind of goes to the civic virtue that Mr. Gentry was talking about earlier. So great job there. I want to point out that everybody who was on this panel participated at nationals last year and did excellently there. So we do this so everybody can model the kind of excellent work that these students just did. So everybody give them a little virtual round of applause. One of the parts of feedback that I thought was great was the use of evidence, that there was a wide variety of evidence that is going to be, that everybody used in answering both the testimony and the Q&A. And so speaking of evidence, and now I think everybody can go back to speaker view. So speaking of evidence, we now have Jessica Matlock, former We the People alum, or current We the People alum, CACE volunteer. She's going to talk a little bit more about evidence. And do you want us to screen share the document?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Great.
All right, hello everybody again. Panelists, you guys just killed that, and I definitely remember judging all of you at district, so super proud of you. You guys killed it. So we're going to talk about evidence now, and you just saw the panelists give amazing evidence. That's what Clint just said about the feedback. So basically, the way I was thinking through this of how to talk about this is it's kind of like writing an essay where you want to make an argument and a claim, but you don't want that to just come out of nowhere. So evidence is where you back up the claims that you're trying to make. So if you have an opinion about something and you're trying to, argue it, you need things to back it up. So here's some stuff to get you started. Okay, and also I wanted to point out, so this says be belong in every full testimony and question and answer. Not every time that you speak in Q&A are you going to need to have every single one of these as an example. You want to use one, but holistically as a group, you want to be using all of them. And you're going to be using different types and different things depending on the unit, but overall it'll all be in there. And you also want evidence specifically for question, Q&A, like we just saw, you don't know what's coming at you. So you want to have evidence just kind of in your pocket, ready for kind of anything. So you're going to learn a lot through this class. I just want to stress that a lot. So first thing, philosophy. We started talking about classical republicanism today. We're going to talk about natural rights later. So you want to pin your ideas on those. That's the foundation of our documents is philosophy. Another line of evidence for that, one that I use all the time, I don't know if this technically goes in the philosophy category, but I'm going to put it there, is the Federalist Papers. So that is the founders' reasoning for why they wrote the Constitution. You could also put that in historical event, whatever. It doesn't really, the subcategories doesn't matter completely, but I just wanted to highlight the Federalist Papers because you can actually read why they decided to put things in the Constitution or arguing to do so. Yeah, so, and then historical events and examples. That's pretty self-explanatory, but a specific, moment in time. So for example, if you were arguing or trying to argue that you thought the judicial branch was the weakest branch of government, your reasoning and your evidence, or your reasoning could be okay, they can't enforce their rulings. So that's your reasoning. And then your evidence can be, so when Andrew Jackson tried to do the Trail of Tears, the Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional, you can't do that. And he turned around and said, they made their ruling, now let them enforce it. He did it anyways. So there's your evidence. Next one is laws, actions, and policies. So again, just specific, a specific piece of legislation or something that you can point to support your argument. Another example for this one is if you're arguing, we've kind of talked about this earlier, presidents have too much power. That's your argument. Or that expanded too much recently. You can point to the authorization of use of military force that they authorized after 9/11, which is still in effect and gives presidents broad military powers. That's where you're coming in with that. And then connecting it to a current event as well. So you can use multiple pieces of evidence in an answer. Like if I was talking about the authorization of use of military force, and then I can tie it into a current event, which is, you know, the Trump administration sending Border Patrol agents unmarked into Portland. You make a strong connection between the past evidence and the current evidence, and that just makes your argument even stronger. So precedent and case law, I think, is, you know, you can really bring some razzle-dazzle points into that, because if you're understanding cases in a thorough way, you're understanding the history, you're understanding, you know, the in-depth philosophical principle that it came from, you're understanding like where you're going with it. And yeah, I can share this one too. I just typed up my notes, but I can make it a little bit prettier so I can share it with you guys too. So new best friend, if you guys haven't talked about this yet, oyez.org, spelled OYEZ.org. That's what they say at the start of every Supreme Court case is, oh yay, oh yay. Anyways, breaks down all Supreme Court cases beautifully. I think I lived on that during We the People, and I still use it a lot. It's a great resource. And you can hear the cases too if you want to listen to them. Yeah, go there, get familiar with it. You're going to be doing a lot of case law, and it's really fun. And again, different units, you're going to use case law a little bit more or less. Like Unit 4, Unit 5, you use case law a lot. So if you're into that already, try to get in those units. So an example for case law would be if you're trying to argue that the government should be protecting privacy rights more, and you want to cite a Supreme Court case that used privacy. So Roe v. Wade extended privacy. I know we all know that, and we know it's about abortion, but really it was about privacy rights, and the government's not allowed to intrude on, you know, your opinion or your health outcomes with your own doctor. That's what the case was about. So if you're trying to argue we should be extending that for technological privacy rights, you can anchor your argument in the Supreme Court case and drop another one too. There's other cases for privacy rights. So it's really fun. I really like cases. It's a good way to put it in there. Statistics, that one's pretty self-explanatory. It's a statistic. You know, this is probably what you're most familiar with from writing essays and writing evidence. Is it's a number. It's right there. They used it really well in the last testimony about, you know, our voting power in California versus Wisconsin. Oh yes, year of the case. Clint's totally right. Then it, you know, just shows you're even more knowledgeable, and it also shows historical progression, so you know where you're at in the timeline. And then personal story / anecdotes. Yes, Clint is also right. Cite statistic. You want your citation. You're basically citing things as you're speaking them. So don't just say, oh, there's a number and it's right because I said so. Like, we want to know where you found it, why it's a legitimate number. Statistics can be very manipulated, as I'm sure we all know from paying attention in the world. So personal stories / anecdotes. Again, like, so Clint has on here, Clint wrote this document, by the way, not me, the big one, but, you know, it's not a cool story, tell it again, bro. It's something that, you know, short, poignant, it's about your argument. So mine here, my example that I put was, you know, you could tell like your personal immigration story if you were arguing about that our immigration system is dysfunctional or needs to be reformed in some way. That's an amazing example that perfectly talks about, or, you know, exemplifies your claim. And it's not going to be some rambling, like, we don't want to hear your whole life story, but just some little blip is awesome. Yeah, and as tying these all in together is the best way, like I said. If you can drop like a philosophy, a case law, and a current event into your answer, and you'll get really good. I know it sounds super overwhelming right now, but you're going to get really good at doing that. And like, you're going to learn so much and know so much by the time you're in competition and you're, you know, working with your unit. You're just kind of amazed at yourself with how many examples you can pull out of the bag. Yeah, I don't know. Clint, do you have anything else to add? Did I cover things?
I think that was great. Yeah, that's exactly right. And we saw, I think, the panel use, I think, all of these types of evidence, except for anecdotes.
Yeah.
And I just want to kind of underline what Jessica was saying, that anecdotes should be used very, very sparingly, if at all. The only time that I've seen them be really, really effective is in an immigration context. I think it was Daniel's unit that actually did one at Nationals, or maybe I'm wrong. But yeah, that was fantastic. But it's tough because I understand students want to, you know, say, well, I volunteered at you know, some sort of volunteering group, and like that's an example of civic virtue. That's probably true, but you can probably find a better example. That's the key with We the People, is not just citing evidence that fits, it's citing the best evidence. And figuring out what the best evidence is tricky. It's very tricky. It takes some time to get used to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's no like necessarily right answer of that too. It's about how you're arguing it. So, you know, my idea of best piece of evidence is going to be totally different than Clint's if we have completely different arguments about a topic. And you should also be preparing for counter arguments as well. So if you are making a claim, especially in your testimony, because that's what the judges focus on to ask your questions, you want to make sure that you have evidence to back up where you think they're going to push back on you, if that makes sense. So if you say, you know, I can't come up with an example right now. You say X, judges say, well, I think it's not X, it's Y. You need to have a good example of why it's not Y, and it definitely is X. That's the best I got.
That's great, Jessica. Thank you. And I know there was a question on the chat. The document that Jessica was referencing should be in the Google file folder that we sent out with the invite email. If you need it again, just go back to that email and it's right there.
And I can add, Clint, do you want me to just add the examples that I put just on that document in the
Sure, feel free, go ahead.
Sweet, thanks everybody.
Thank you. So we saw a panel talk a lot about individual right, or excuse me, about classical republicanism and our founding documents. We got a lot of really great examples of evidence. Mr. Gentry, Sean talked earlier about classical republicanism. I'm gonna talk a little bit about natural rights philosophy. And so Amy, if you can pull up the slide and start where we left off. I'm not going to go too far into depth because you guys are going to go very, very far in depth on this in your actual classes. These are concepts that you're going to become so familiar with that it's going to be just something that is old hat. But Mr. Gentry talked a lot about many of the philosophers that so-called classical republicanism is based on. Well, then the Enlightenment happened, and you know, you can and will go be able to argue quite a bit as to whether the Enlightenment was actually in any way enlightened, but it happened basically starting around the 15th century and the 16th century, primarily among upper middle or upper class white people in Europe. And out of the Enlightenment came this idea of natural rights philosophy. Well, what is natural rights philosophy? Natural rights philosophy is sort of the counterpoint to classical republicanism. Classical republicanism generally values collective responsibility, collective good, the common good, above individual rights. The common good should be subservient to individual rights. Well, natural rights philosophy, they kind of said, philosophers generally said, we're not so sure about that. And it's based primarily on three different people, although there are many, many, many more natural rights philosophers that we could talk about and that you'll become familiar with. And that's Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So let's talk a little bit about them. Amy, if I can get the next slide. Whoops. Okay. So collectively, these natural rights philosophers, they believe that humans are not necessarily social or political by nature. This is different from classical republicanism, which believes that everybody's inherently social, everybody's inherently political. Natural rights philosophers, they say no. Let's take a step back. Let's imagine where people were when there were no governments and everybody was basically stepping out of a cave. And they called this a state of nature. Now, what is a state of nature? It means there's no government and everybody is basically in that for themselves. And if you think about it, if there's no government, if there's no one to say, well, these people have rights, these other people don't have rights, then everybody has the exact same rights. There is nobody who's the president. There's nobody who's a king in a state of nature because there's just no government, there's no enforcement. So everybody is equal. And then the question then is like, what happens, how do people protect themselves in a state of nature? Because theoretically, if there's no law, there's nobody to enforce anything, then anybody can come around and steal your stuff, they can kill you, they can beat you up, and that's the problem of the state of nature. So you have to be protected from one another in order to survive. And whereas classical Republicans thought that happiness, this idea of happiness, was a collective thing. It involved the polity, all getting together to work towards the common good. Natural rights philosophies, it's whether you're happy or I'm happy, that's up to you. All right, next slide. The purpose of politics, therefore, for natural rights philosophers is self-preservation. As we talked about, you're in a state of nature, you need to protect yourself and your family. It's also to maintain order, because obviously, if there is, or now, as natural rights philosophers argued, if there is no state, if there is nobody to declare what people can do and what people can't do, then you get into chaos or potential chaos. So maintaining order was very important. You also need a state to protect rights and liberties. For natural rights philosophers, the three rights and liberties that are most important, that are paramount, that are fundamental, those are life, liberty, and property. And if those three rights sound familiar, that's because they're the same three rights, basically, that are mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, and we're going to talk about that. Thomas Jefferson called property the pursuit of happiness for his own reasons. But life, liberty, and property is that concept comes directly from natural rights philosophers. And it's also for the common defense, to protect you from others, from invading hordes. Next slide. So for natural rights philosophers, they look at this concept of good government is that the people are sovereign. Now, they have a lot of different arguments amongst themselves, amongst Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, about what that sovereignty means, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But all power, all sovereignty is derived from the people, and that is the key focus of natural rights philosophers that the founders took, is this notion of popular sovereignty. So that it's really important, this notion of a government for the people, by the people. By the people, the people are giving sovereignty to this government. As we said before, individuals are largely self-sufficient. Government is by the consent of the governed. In order for a government to have sovereignty, the people must consent to that government. There has to be, what we'll talk about later, a contract, a social contract between the government and the people. And moreover, the government has to be limited in some way. The government must obey its own laws. That's what that's what we call rule of law, this notion that no person is above the law, but the government must obey the law and is therefore limited in some way. That is different than sort of an absolute monarchy that can do whatever it wants. Although, again, there are some differences among the natural rights philosophers as to what that means. The public and private spheres are separate. The people are separate from each other because of this social contract. So there is a difference from classical Republican philosophy, where public and private were the same. They overlapped. There was no privacy necessarily. It was whatever you did in your private sphere had to be for the collective good. Natural rights philosophers say, no, I have my stuff and that's mine. And the public has their stuff and that's theirs. And then there was also a difference between the government providing what people want. For Thomas Hobbes, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, the only thing the government provided, because the only thing that people wanted, was security. Security, and when it says security, it means from others, from people who are not in my state, in my sovereign unit. That was security. For Locke, he was concerned about that type of security, but he was also very concerned about the government protecting individual liberty and property. Locke was big about property, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. Okay, next slide. So for natural rights philosophers, they would say if you're giving people what you want, if there's a split between the public and private spheres, if government is by consent, all of those things are good government. Bad government is when a government is not representative, it's not responsive, it violates rights, and it's not law-abiding. So those are bad types of government for natural rights philosophers. And when you're listening to this, and when you're listening to this lecture, when you're listening to other lectures from your teachers down the road, when you're formulating your testimonies as you go forward, I want you to critically analyze. Think about this in the context not just of the founders when they were creating the Constitution and the government, but in today. How would our government be evaluated by natural rights philosophers? I think you can make some interesting arguments either way. Next slide, please. So, social contract theory. The very first person to popularize social contract theory was this guy named Thomas Hobbes, who was a British dude, sort of an aristocrat, and he wrote a book called The Leviathan in 1651. And if you look at that little picture down at the bottom there, that is the cover of the Leviathan. It is very metal. If you can zoom in, or if you can Google the cover of the Leviathan, you see that big king right there. Well, what he is made up of is all of the people, basically. And that is a very heavy-handed metaphor, but it fits very perfectly with Thomas Hobbes' philosophy. That is what is being depicted there is an absolute monarch lording over his people. And the reason why he is an absolute monarch is because the collective free will of his citizens, of his subjects, has been granted to him, to the king, to serve as sovereign. So he says, during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, so that's during the social contract, during a state of nature, rather, during that time, those people are in conditions called war, and such a war as if of every man against every man. So what do you do when you're in this state of nature, which he called nasty, brutish, and short? Well, the only way out of anarchy is to surrender your free will entirely to a monarch. That was Hobbes' idea. And for him, that was the social contract. Go to the next slide. Yeah, he says to secure against the eternal fear of death, the war of all against all, the people will, as a matter of course, agree to submit to the Leviathan. For him, the Leviathan is the king, the supreme power. It is a monarch with absolute dominion over all, and the absolute duty to protect the lives and subsistence of its constituency. Now, you'll note that we're talking about absolute monarchy. There's a social contract there because the people have given their free will, but there isn't necessarily a way for the people to take back the free will. And that ruffled some feathers among other natural rights philosophers. We can go forward. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think we already read that. Next slide. Okay, so the person who was most ruffled by this, or at least the most prominent person who was ruffled by Thomas Hobbes' idea, was this guy, John Locke. John Locke, he wrote in 1689 the second treatise on civil government. And if you were going to ask anybody what is the philosophical work that our founders most relied upon in formulating their constitution, I would argue it's probably the second treatise on civil government from John Locke. John Locke looked at Thomas Hobbes' ideas and he said he agreed with some of them, but not all of them. He thought that the state of nature was actually, it was kind of a state of peace and goodwill. And that the state is only necessary to protect property. So in his view of the social contract, the governed agree to give up their absolute liberties and hand authority over to a state, but only really to enforce property and contract rights and protect the lives and property of law-abiding citizens against those who would violate the law of nature or the community. Now, those people who would violate it also include foreign enemies as well as domestic criminals. Now, I don't know if anybody's seen The Walking Dead. I don't know if you guys still watch that. I used to watch it. It's an okay show. But John Locke kind of looks at, or the way that I would describe John Locke's social contract is he looks at kind of like the little groups in The Walking Dead as a sort of first level social contract. That's all of those people have come together and they have a structure of authority that everybody agrees by. Rick was the leader for a while. I don't know. Again, it's not that great a show, but I'm going to go on with the metaphor. And that's sort of like Rick was there to protect people's life, liberty, and property. That was kind of it, and everybody kind of followed it. And then he also then has sort of a second level social contract, which is like a full government, a full functioning government, like the government that was going on in England at the time. Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right. So before we get to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I do want to highlight something about Locke that is very, very different than Hobbes. Locke believed that, unlike Hobbes, that the king, he believed in the monarchy. He said that you could have a king, and you should have a king, to protect people's life, liberty, and property. But the key difference that he had was that he believed that if the king or the state violates those fundamental rights, doesn't protect life, liberty, and property, or runs what he called a long train of abuses against its citizens, that the people have the duty and in fact the right to revolt against that king. They have the duty to overthrow that king and cancel the social contract. Kind of like people get canceled these days, like the social contract is canceled. That is a very Lockean idea. And that, again, the Declaration of Independence is basically Thomas Jefferson writing as if he were John Locke in the Second Treatise on Civil Government. So then we go forward and we talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was very different than Locke and Hobbes. He was, I think he was Belgian, something like that. He wasn't British. So he said that his most famous quote, which is not here, is that all men are born free and yet everyone is in chains. And he goes on and says, every man being born free and master of himself, no one else may, under any pretext whatsoever, subject him without his consent. To assert that the son of a slave is born a slave is to assert that he is not born a man. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was more egalitarian, much more egalitarian than John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Certainly, Rousseau had his own problems that you guys will learn about. But Rousseau kind of believed that the state of nature was kind of good, actually, in the sense that all men were equal in that state of nature. For him, the only legitimate social contract was when you created a state where, again, everyone was equal, and it wasn't creating a state by creating a king who lorded over us like Hobbes, or even a civil government like Locke suggested, but a state where everyone was equal. Now, of course, Rousseau, like most people of his age, or like many people of his age, I should say, excluded lots of people when he says everyone being equal. He excluded women and minorities and lower social classes. He was also kind of a jerk. But that was his idea, that it should be this sort of egalitarian social contract. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, he says that he thinks that pre-civilized humans were not warlike, but generally peaceful. The state of nature was okay, and the only problem was the advent of property rights that necessitates the existence of a state. Rousseau looked at Locke's idea about a government protecting privacy and said, yeah, or a government protecting property rather, and said, yeah, that's the problem, is that the government is set up to protect property. So he then in his theory of human development, there is this parable about the development of humans through the education of a child. And you guys will read that, you'll become familiar with it. And he argues that a civilized man is not the pinnacle of human development, but merely an extreme of the possibilities. Savage human societies are the optimal middle grounds. And he says savage, he means egalitarian. Again, this is loaded language, but that's what they meant. Next slide, please. So what principles of natural rights philosophy would you expect to find in America's founding documents? My guess is you guys can start writing them in the comments. You can go forward to the next slide. Like we already talked about the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence is a natural rights philosophy smorgasbord. It's all about, well, King George has violated this right and that right, and here's the long train of abuses, and therefore we have the right to cancel the social contract and start our own. Early state constitutions also heavily reflected natural rights philosophy, as does the Constitution of the United States. You can go forward. So for early state governments, they said that they had constitutions. They had colonial charters initially, and then once the revolution, they started these early state constitutions, which were social contracts that were limiting governments. Typically, a lot of the early state constitutions had bills of rights first. It was, you have the right to life, liberty, and property. You have the right to freedom of religion. You have the right to freedom of speech. That was first in those early state government constitutions. And you had rule of law. You had this notion that the state constitution, that the government was subject to its own laws. We can go to the next one. Okay, here's an example in the Virginia Bill of Rights, Section 1, all men are by nature equally free and independent, and they have certain inherent rights of which they can enter into a state of society. That's basically it. We have certain inherent rights of which when they can enter into a state of society. That's social contract theory right there. They cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So this is just a reflection of natural rights philosophy right there in the Virginia Bill of Rights from 1776. We go to the next one. So we in the United States Constitution also have reflections of natural rights philosophy, also in the preamble where it says we are ordained to protect individual rights. We have a written constitution, we have separation of powers, checks and balances. You're going to learn all about how those work. We talked a little bit about them last week. Legislative supremacy, in other words, the people are giving their consent to the government through the legislature, which is the reflection of people, of the polity. And then you have election, impeachment, removal. That is this idea of revolution writ small. So you have the ability to, if you do not like the government, to get the bums out, to have a sort of mini revolution by electing or impeaching or removing. So next slide. So here's the question that I believe the We the People program asks the best, or is most focused on at its core, is you have these ideas, these competing ideas of classical republicanism and natural rights, of the common good and individual liberty. And the framers were looking at this question when they created the Constitution. And the question is, so they wrote this document. Did they strike the right balance between those two things of trying to promote the common good while also protecting individual rights? And that is a question that is very, very difficult to answer from the very beginning all the way to today. James Monroe, who was our fourth president, said, Americans have always managed to weigh the celebration of individual with responsibility for the community, market striving with civic caring, the private sphere, and the public good. He said that Americans have always managed to weigh those things. But when you're weighing something, something's got to give. Something's better than, ends up being more important than the other. And so the question is did they get it right back then for them? And did they get it right for us now and everybody in between? And so that's the question that I think you're going to struggle with throughout this program, and it's the fun part. So that is my spiel on natural rights. Once again, you're going to learn a lot more about this going forward. I'm excited for you to do so. What we're going to do right now is we're going to take another break and come back at about 12:10. And when we come back, we're going, I think Suba is going to give some tips and tricks that we've developed to do well in the We the People program. And then we're going to break up into groups like we did last week. And the main thing that we're going to be talking about in our various groups is what is the most important civic duty, civic responsibility, and what is the least important civic duty and civic responsibility. We heard a lot of discussion from the panel earlier about civic duties. We talked about jury duty, we talked about voting, we talked about education, we talked about all of those things. Well, what's the most important? And what do you think is maybe the least important? So we're going to have that conversation, then we're going to come back and we're going to vote. So it's 12:05. Everybody come back at about 12:10.
Amy is going to share the document that we have again in that resources folder that Clint sent out. So the purpose of this conversation is to really talk about what makes teams great. You all can go through the process, read all the materials, digest it all, present it in a nice way. But these are the sort of best practices that we have come up with as members of CACE to really help you succeed and get as many points as possible. A lot of this is kind of thinking about how do we go beyond what's written directly in the text, and how do we go beyond what's the sort of bare minimum requirements of We the People. And I think in some ways, this class is very different than maybe any of your other high school classes in that, one, it kind of takes a lot of time, but two, it requires you to think in a way that is very, very structured and very, very rigorous and analytical without being like quantitative mathy, right? You have to be able to diagnose an argument, get it to its bare bones, bring it in with supporting evidence. It's basically, trying to bring together a lot of the skills that you've gained throughout your life into one synthesized 4-minute presentation and 6 to 8 minutes of Q&A. And that's really hard. So what we try to do is try and figure out what will make you all successful at doing just that. So the first thing that we recommend to students is primarily looking at what's going on around you today. And that requires you to take a focus on current events. And that you can be looking at specifically the US, but also we would encourage you to think globally. Systems of jurisprudence are not unique to the United States. especially if you're Unit 6, you're gonna have to bring in a lot of different global examples when it comes to ways and like judicial systems are set up. So we recommend that you consume at least 3 to 4 sources of news per day. This could be something as simple as listening to like a podcast or like the NPR politics podcast or 538 or the Daily, listening to or reading news aggregations, roll-ups, things like that. I personally recommend like the PBS NewsHour. I think it's a good summary of, you know, today's top effects. When it comes to picking your news sources, try to go to an unbiased source. Insofar as like we used to think back like a decade ago that like the New York Times is a very unbiased source. I think depending on the current like mainstream media cycle, one can argue that it's not, you know, totally free of bias. Nothing will ever be, but typically we try and stick to you know, valid sources of news. So no Drudge Report. That's just not happening. Please share this with your unit. So if you're in Unit 4 and you have a really interesting case about federalism, it might be useful to send that out to, you know, Unit 3 or Unit 5 if there's a court case at hand, or if this relates to maybe like 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, stuff like that. It might be useful to kind of share that knowledge. That will just keep you as a more informed human, but ultimately will help you kind of think critically about these issues outside of the vacuum of a specific question. The second thing is you want to outline your testimonies before you write them. The reason for that is that you are going to be very likely a 3, 4, or 5 person unit. When you have, you know, 5 people writing in a document, it is very helter-skelter. It might be too many cooks in the kitchen. But if you start your process by writing an outline, you know exactly what ideas you're going to try and convey, and you know what order that you're going to put them in. That matters a lot, because even if you go back and you revamp some testimony, you restructure it, you still know what the core bones of the outline of the question are. So the format for We the People questions tends to be an umbrella question. So what's the overarching themes that the question is trying to answer, as well as the first sub-bullet and the second sub-bullet. The first and second might be tied together, they might not be tied together, but if you start with a thesis that answers the larger umbrella question, and you clearly say, this is the answer to sub-question 1, this is the answer of sub-question 2, then you have a very cohesive and comprehensive argument, and then you can kind of start filling it in with your key points and your evidence. I think every English teacher will say that you have to start with a thesis, and you absolutely do have to make that clear to us. Like Clint and so many others have said, you know, it's not enough just to understand the question. You need to have opinions. You need to have formulated some thoughts on this process. And that's where the thesis portion makes that very clear. Like, what is your stance, or what do you believe? Don't go to a position super quickly without, you know, talking to your teammates before, during, and after you write your testimonies. A lot of times you can just kind of battle it out. You hear each other's point of views, you hear each other's sides, and this goes back to the fact that we don't want anybody to feel very like one-sided, or any testimony or any presentation to feel one-sided. And if you are debating your positions or creating that discourse and that dialogue within your unit, it's going to strengthen your testimony, it's going to strengthen your Q&A, and it's going to make sure that when, I think Jessica put this scenario in there that happens all the time in We the People. If you say X is my opinion, I as a judge will say, no, I think X is wrong, Y is my opinion. And you have something that's in your back pocket and say, yeah, we thought about Y, but here's why it's not correct. Now that shows us that you have a fundamental understanding, and that reasoning score is really taking into account the fact that you're willing to push back and say, like, this is my opinion because of X, ABC. The second the fourth thing is get feedback on your testimonies. So your teachers are going to be doing that. Your peers are going to be doing that. You need to kind of be willing to show this to as many people within your class as possible. This isn't something you want to be cagey about. You want to get that constructive feedback. Like, the more feedback you get, it's going to get better. Like your presentation style will get better. The content of the testimony will be much more clear. And you'll be really able to sort of drill down to, what you think is important and what becomes important throughout that feedback process. And this sort of goes hand in hand with the idea of asking for help, right? You have your teachers, you have your classmates, you all will get very, very close. But realize that CACE is here for you as well. We are all there to support you. So, folks like Clint, folks like Beck, Sean, all of us are going to be here to support you. And that's why we have this Slack in place. So if your unit has a question or your class has a question, post it in the Slack. The reasons you want to post it in the Slack rather than email us personally is that, like, if I have a busy week and Clint sees it, Clint will answer it. And then you don't have to wait a week for me to get back to you. So please use the Slack. That's why it's there. If you haven't gotten access to the Slack, please email Clint. I think the email is already in the chat. So ask for help. We are there to support you. Again, your success is our success. So we want to make you get better. And I just want to say, like, the alumni panel did a really, really great job today. And they are also a really great resource. They have been through it. They have likely seen the things that you are going to see, and they can provide you with a very unique insight. So ask them for help. They're all very nice people. You'll get better through the process. Okay, so I think there's a couple good things that we focused on when we did the alumni panel, and I think it came up as one of the Q&A questions. Is good teams can identify problems, but great teams will identify solutions. So if you are ever saying that something is, fundamentally wrong or it needs to be changed, you need to have a solution. It has to be somewhat of a well thought out solution, right? If you're saying that, like, gun violence is a problem in America, you can't just say, we have to get rid of all guns everywhere. Like, where is the citation? How would you create a solution? Would you use background checks? What are you going to do to make it feasible to actually pass? Because we want to make everything feasible in the context of what governmental institutions that we have. So we have to kind of think about what is it that is going to be feasible given our current situation. I think that this is the one thing that'll be very hard. It's not very easy to come up with solutions because a lot of these are overarching problems. Like, if you ask anyone on this, in CACE, what's the solution to gridlock, we would all give you 8 different answers. We don't know what the solution is, but if you can think of things that are comprehensive and that make sense given the context, then you should be willing to back up your solution with some sort of evidence or some sort of other data that validates what your thinking is. A lot of the times, there are very, very smart, like, law professors or very smart people that have written about these solutions that you're proposing, and it's helpful to look to them as a citation or a piece where you can, or at least something that you can cite. Finally, I think there's a few other things. You should always practice arguing the other side of every position you take. Great teams will always showcase both sides, but will have an opinion, very, very clear. And so in our case, we tended to have a person who was much more conservative and was, like, very into federalism. And I would say that the majority of us were anti-federalist. But when it came to the balance, right, we were a 5-person unit. Typically, 1 or 2 people would kind of go and help out the guy who was on the federalist side or took a more traditionally conservative viewpoint, because it makes your testimony feel a little bit balanced and you're not kind of totally ignoring the other side. You want to make sure that every argument that you make has its own merit and has weight. And if you, like, sometimes that will change your opinion as a result of, doing that often enough. Finally, again, I cannot stress this one enough. You have to work with other units in your class. Like, there are so many times when we have seen, a unit 6 get a unit 5 question, or a unit 5 get a unit 1 question. What are the philosophical underpinnings? you don't want to get like, you don't want to have a gotcha moment. You never want to have that when you're in We the People. But if you're listening to your peers' testimonies, if you're listening to the evidence that they're providing, if you kind of have your own sessions with them to say like, hey, these are the problems that we're dealing with in our unit. How do you think we can apply, a Federalist paper? How do you think that the founders would have thought about X, Y, and Z? It would help you both, because now they get a perspective from your unit side and you get a perspective from their unit side. And you can kind of bridge the gap there. And then I think at the end of the day, like, We the People is a very fun process. If it weren't fun, like, none of the alumni would be here. Like, if, it is probably the highlight of a lot of people's senior years, because you learn so much and you're working together, and it's really hard, but it's really fun. So aside from all the hard work that you're going to put in, you will also like have lives, and you should also enjoy your senior year. Like, you need to like just have fun. Like, it doesn't matter. You don't need to spend all 18 hours a day with your unit. Like, that's not the case. Like, you can go hang out, I guess, socially distanced, do other fun things, like insofar as you can. Just like get to know your unit as people. At the end of this, like, the ideal case is that you all become friends, and this is happy fun times. But I cannot stress this enough. This is supposed to be a fun experience at its core. You learn a lot, you work really hard, but you're also supposed to have a lot of fun. And so that is also a win for us, when this is a really fun class to be a part of. That's about it.
Yeah. Anybody have anything to add? Krishna Prakash is noting, remember sister units. So once you get placed into units, sister units are generally 1 and 6, 2 and 4, and 3 and 5. Those are a lot of good resources. Anybody else?
I wanted to note that when you get feedback, and Suba talked a lot about how you should take it into consideration, use it to modify your testimony, but you're actually going to end up getting conflicting feedback. You're going to, even on the same testimony, you're going to hear from me that I didn't like something, and you're going to hear from Clint that he loved that same something. And so one of your jobs is going to be to parse through and find out, like, or decide for yourselves whether it's useful to your testimony or not. And so don't take every piece of feedback as gospel, because if you do, you'll just spin your wheels forever and you'll keep rewriting over and over again. Eventually you have to settle on what you believe is the best argument to answer the question posed, and it's not going to please every judge.
Yeah, I will say, like, there are some times when you're going to need to like take the feedback with a grain of salt. Like, sometimes it may be harsh, or it may feel like it's a lot to take in. Like, that is a part of the process. But I would agree with Sean in that, like, if you really want to stick to your guns on something, then maybe it's not just the idea. Maybe it just needs to be reformatted and restructured in a way that makes it more relevant to the question. So I think there's a component where you also kind of have to stick to your guns, and you're gonna learn that, right? Like, it just depends on what the context is and what the feedback is that you're getting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We're all happy to give feedback. If you have a concern about whether or not you should be following one of those feedbacks, just ask your teacher. Your teacher is going to be happy to make an ultimate call. So yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Once again, for folks who are worried about the Slack, we will get everybody into the Slack. Amador, Florida, and Irvington will get you it. We have your email addresses. For folks who are from other schools, please just send me an email at clint@caciviceducation.org, and we will get those out, I hope, within the next week. And then, so what we're going to do now is we're all going to break up into, I think, is it 6, Amy? Or is it 5?
I think it's 5, and it's
okay.
You, Daniel, Jessica, Sean, and Suba are leading rooms.
Yep. Okay. So we're all going to break up into 5 different rooms. Everybody who is not me, Suba, Jessica, Daniel, and Sean are going to get randomly placed into rooms. And so when you get randomly placed into there, we're all going to sort of lead a discussion. And the discussion is going to go basically like this. We're going to talk about, okay, we talked about civic duties. Let's list some civic duties. Let's just brainstorm. There are going to be alumni in there to help, but we're all going to just call on you if you're not volunteering. And then once we get sort of a good list, then we'll start talking about which one is more important and which one isn't and why. And the why is the really important part. That's the reasoning. That's the understanding. It is demonstrating how you're sort of applying the knowledge and not just being like, well, jury duty sucks, so I don't want to do it. That kind of stuff. So, all right, Amy.
All right. Resume. Thank you for the reminder.
Wanted to check there.
So we did a poll. Recap is that voting won, closely followed by education, everything else a distant third on most important civic duty.
Okay.
Least.
So we totally
So let's skip over to the least, since we have two people who are just not going to vote. Two people do not believe that voting is the most important civic duty. Not do it.
And feel free to talk in the chat about why you voted the way you did, and we're going to read it.
Okay. If we want to end this one, can we end this one? All right. That's the results. Nice work, everybody. We're gonna. Okay. Now, can we put up the least important one?
We were struggling with that one in our group.
There were a bunch like got no votes.
Okay.
Duty.
Do we want to do a separate poll for least important or no?
Sure.
Oh, I didn't realize we were doing that. I'm sorry.
No problem.
I'm looking at Clint to say this is a wrong take.
Yeah, it's a bad take, but it's fine. It's fine. Voting is more important now than ever. So.
That's true.
Do you want uneducated jurors, Clint?
I sure do not. As a matter of fact.
That's my case.
Absolutely not.
Right. In our room, we talked a little bit about what education means or meant to the founders too, and how it's not necessarily just being book smart or getting smarter and smarter. It's educating yourself on the way to interact effectively with your society.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, we're getting up the next poll. Let's remind everybody that we have a third summer session on August 15th. We will get everybody into the Slack by then who wants to be in the Slack. You can, get into the Slack after that if you want to. What we're going to be doing that time is we're going to be talking about the Bill of Rights. Primarily, we're going to be talking about incorporation a little bit, but then we're actually going to be splitting you up into small groups where you're going to actually write a testimony and do a Q&A just in the 3 hours that we have. So it will be a chance for you to be judged. We're going to bring you back in, and people are going to give a testimony to everybody. It's a really great time for you guys to practice doing a Q&A and practice doing a testimony to answer these questions, because it is something that you're going to get used to. And so it's better to cut your teeth early than late. This is least. Pretend it says least. Everybody can vote.
Least, yeah.
No. The census is important, y'all. You just don't know it yet. Census is very important.
Yeah. Depends.
Very important.
Determines how much money you get.
Your district, your.
Yeah. So if your parents haven't done it,
Heaven and hot.
do your census. Tell your parents.
Tell your parents to do the census.
Tweet about it. I don't know.
Wow.
A lot of military service. I think that's
jury duty.
Take. That is a take.
Yeah, I mean,
Military service. Is it a take?
I didn't say it. Yeah.
I think it's like military service is definitely gonna win this one.
Yeah, it's running away, and I get it. The founders and especially Aristotle and that crew would disagree from a classical Republican point of view. But I think a lot of this the voting this way might be because the military services, we understand it modernly, is so trumped up compared to, I think, what it was historically.
Trumped up.
I didn't mean it that way, but yeah. And so when you look at it relatively, it's given more emphasis in our society maybe than a lot of people think it should be.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on which society too, right? Like, I mean, I'm a Taiwanese citizen as well as an American citizen, and if I go into Taiwan with my Taiwan passport, I'm getting conscripted, right? So for that society, it means a lot more than American society. So.
All right, everybody. We really appreciate everybody participating. We had a lot of fun. We hope you did too. We are also going to be recording this and we'll post it on our YouTube. And we're really looking forward to the third summer session on August 15th. If you haven't signed up for that, please do so. Your teacher should have the sign up if you don't have it already. Also, we will have probably in early October a testimony writing workshop to teach you kind of how to write a testimony, because by then you're going to be actually in units and working on your testimonies for district and regional. So that'll be really exciting. So really excited to work with you going forward and have fun.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.